You can't save her. You can't save anyone.
What's gonna happen to me?
We gotta keep moving forward. We will beat this. Together.
Thanks.
This game is not a Resident Evil game, therefore I don't like it. I'm pretty sure you heard this opinion echoed throughout forums, community threads, Twitter, YouTube comments, on Twitch comments, etc. A game is not a Resident Evil game, therefore I'm not interested. What does that mean? How do we break down and analyze exactly what is going on when people say these opinions and give our overall feedback and have a discussion? It's not X style game is common within the gaming circle. We saw it currently with Final Fantasy 16 and how people are saying great action game, not a great Final Fantasy game. And I think this stems from the fact that when a franchise progresses forward, whether with a sequel or a remake, people will start to miss elements that made the franchise so popular in the first place. So not a Resident Evil game is actually a critique against those elements where Resident Evil geared more towards the action market. And I assume there are people out there, we know there's staunch people out there that didn't like the turn of the franchise when they hit Resident Evil 4. This is where people actually were saying opinions like RE died as a franchise going forward from here when Resident Evil 4 came out, and it was inspired by more actiony elements. Those elements continued onward into Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6. All of those games, that trifecta video games, Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6, were known for bringing in the action genre to its fullest extent, where to certain people, enemies weren't scary anymore. The zombies were not really prevalent in the franchise anymore. They felt like the identity was killed right then and there. This is why when these games come out, and people say it's not a Resident Evil game, it comes from a place of emotion and, of course, harkening back to what people loved with the days of the past. Granted, how I feel about this opinion? Well, personally, first and foremost, we have to look at the facts. What is Resident Evil known for? Resident Evil is known for building suspense, terror, survival horror action at its finest. Of course there is horror elements, and of course you're conserving ammo and you're trying to save limited resources. Remember, the core of Resident Evil is conserving all your ammo and health so you can get through the next area, fight the next boss, and go forward while solving puzzles. That has always been the core of Resident Evil gameplay as it evolved over time. But this hate and disdain for action is quite hilarious because, I mean, if you put it into perspective, all the RE games contain action to some degree, whether you save up all your resources and you're fighting all these enemies and you're blowing away enemies with basically an overabundance of skill and ammo. You're turning that game into a shooting gallery. This is what I felt when I played the original Resident Evil 2. I felt like I had so much ammo that I could just walk around at the end section and shoot everything with a magnum because I just didn't care at that point. The game basically threw so much at me that I just knew the hook of the game. I didn't feel terrified that I was gonna die or anything. I felt like I was an overpowered god when I got to that final portion of Resident Evil 2. So you could say, hey, Renegade, it's difficulty that factors into every game. Yeah, of course, but the overall thematic of keeping that ammo conservation and true fear was diminished by the time I got to that point in the story. And it's like, you know, action and horror does go hand in hand with this franchise. Now, is there points where they jumped the shark and it went overboard and you're fighting giant mutated T-Rexes all over the place with Resident Evil? Of course, we've seen how far it went with Resident Evil 6, and you're fighting Simmons like fucking 6 times. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely jarring how they went on that pace, and it really didn't pan out well in my opinion, even though I find RE6 to be a guilty pleasure. Now we just take it and we sort of think about it, and I'm like, one of the games in the series that is absolutely praised, and it is indeed more actiony based, is Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, the original. That game had elements where you could dodge. That game had more faster paced elements. You could get certain weapons earlier, like the Magnum. Are we gonna say that's not a Resident Evil game? Absolutely not. In its core, it is. And to balance all of the faster paced elements, they added in the Nemesis creature who pursues you throughout the entire area and hunts Jill down. And that's where the new panic and the new dread comes in for that game. So can you integrate action into Resident Evil and make it feel like a Resident Evil game? Absolutely, 100% yes. But you can also jump the shark and have themes where it's not really super scary anymore. And I think the franchise scares are subjective in my opinion. Like, true fear, horror, and scares and expectations from horror games are subjective from person to person anyway. Like a baseline, when you play RE, you expect puzzle solving, exploration, action combat. Like, you can expect those things, but when it comes to horror and being scared, like sometimes maybe a dog might burst through the window and you find that to be absolutely fear-inducing, whereas I might find that to be funny, ridiculous, and just downright comical as I blow his head off. It all varies from person to person, and that comes with expectations as well. And I think really Capcom has created so many branches of Resident Evil that there is so much going into the fact of expectation for this franchise. So first and foremost, we have people who enjoyed fixed camera Resident Evil, and that's more of the classic survival horror that they want to come back. And I don't think that fixed camera is coming back anymore because Capcom found that profitable margin with modernization of the remakes. That's first and foremost. I think they're gonna keep the horror aesthetics going forward because that is exactly what happened with RE6, where people were like, okay, this game is way too crazy, it's way too bombastic, we gotta tone it down. Fans were like clocking out. That era of RE was met with some division. And it's like night and day. It's like no contest of how people felt about RE6 and Operation Raccoon City, where they were just like, okay, this is too much. But there are people who liked RE6, there are people who liked RE5, there are people who liked RE4. Those are the action junkies, the action crowd, where they're like, okay, this plays like a refined third-person shooter. I want more of this. So those people are happy because not only did they get RE4 remake, but they also got Village, they also got more modernized third-person mechanics. They're fine. I don't know how much or how little they care about the horror elements, but they kind of got what they wanted going forward. As well as classic people, you kind of got the aesthetics still sticking, and that is important going forward from here. And then we have the first-person crowd, where it's like, okay, you got this brand new experience. You might like VR. You might be enthused to know that if you do love VR, then they're making a VR mode for RE4 remake. You might have came into the series sometime during RE7 and RE8 and experiencing those games in first person. It's not like first person hasn't been tinkered with before. We saw these modes in Code Veronica X. We saw them in the light gun games. We saw them in Dead Aim. It is a thing that has happened in the past, just coming up to modern snuff, so to speak. There is 3 demographics that Capcom is trying to cater to, and only one of them constantly talks about how they neglect fixed camera angles and tank controls. And if this was the 1990s, the early 90s, maybe there will be some discussion to be had at the radical gameplay shift, but now we have better controlling mechanics, better functionality. Therefore, I think they're going to stick with first person and third person going forward. So that does leave those fixed camera enthusiasts in the dust. And I think there are some people out there that just simply don't like change. These RE games though, these Resident Evil games coming out still are pretty successful. A lot of people are playing them. Resident Evil 4 Remake recently got like what, 5 million units sold. It's good for business right now for Resident Evil. And this is what Capcom wanted. Let me read a statement that I saw on Twitter talking about their success. It's like, Capcom has an extremely high operating profit margin and ROI, which you can't really find anywhere else, even outside of Japan. And it's like they were struggling for the longest time, but they maintained with high quality content that enabled all this growth. And the final part is important. High quality content enabled Capcom to make all the money that they are making, to see all the success that they are making, because a high majority of people really do like these games. I think this is what the IP holders wanted, and the only way to logically continue a popular survival horror franchise is to keep it as a meta series. A meta series is basically doing spin-offs, doing full-blown main iterations, sequels, remakes. What can we do to keep the train going without it stagnating as much as possible? And this is what they're doing. So you had your Resident Evil 8, you had your remakes, you had your spin-off games, you had a lot of content, and I think there is still more content on the horizon for this franchise. And what makes an RE game is what the IP holders want it to be. Now, quality is always going to be important when judging the merits of these games, and I think that's readily important. As long as they maintain this high quality, the amazing storytelling, the characters feeling more fleshed out and grounded, the creatures and monsters all looking just grotesque, yet amazing on the RE engine, so you want to blow their brains out. It's like, what defines Resident Evil currently is the fact that the quality is now going up. Before, you could say once in a lifetime, once upon a time, they had no direction. They didn't know what the fuck they were doing at one point. I mean, Umbrella Corps, really? You're gonna put out like a COD-like shooter that nobody cares about? You can say at that point that this game is not really what I envisioned for the series, but going back to the drawing board with Resident Evil 7 really enlighten a style that worked. I see that part as really important. That prevents stagnation, because when a game series is bad for the horror genre and it dies off, I think that's worse than anything else. You have to shake it up from time to time, and we talked about this so many times on the channel. Why did they change shit? I don't like that they changed this and that, and they don't go back to this, and this was RE. This isn't an RE game. Like I said, what makes Resident Evil is the non-stagnation and the fact that they have been putting out games that are considered to be high quality in the midst of a lot of broken releases and shit like that. Like, Capcom has been doing really well in that regard, in terms of that and the general expectation of at least getting a functional and fun game to play. So there is that. That's why people constantly buy RE over and over again, because at least they're putting out a decent game and they're preventing themselves from being stagnant. So you have 3 sort of camera styles, and 1 got axed, and now you have 2, and then you're having remakes where there's this whole remake boom in the works, and people are sort of gravitating towards what's the next remake gonna be for Resident Evil. It brings in excitement, and that excitement delves into whatever the next game is, so they can remake RE5 and people will be excited because it's something that they trust Capcom with after RE4 remake, so they can make an action game and people would like it. Despite the flaws that are in RE4 remake that I don't like the stun locking, I still will look forward to Resident Evil 5, and it's an action game. It's 100% an action game where you're fighting Majini in like Africa. So there is expectations, and there is a means to go in and put all this fruit in a blender and see what comes out with your franchise, but you have to experiment to stay alive. The numbers don't lie, the stats don't lie, and what differs on what is a Resident Evil game is something that differs from person to person. But in my opinion, whether it's action, whether it's horror, as long as it's entertaining, I will continue to play it. And as long as this quality is maintained, then what is defined as a Resident Evil game will be definitely played by my standards, because what I expect is just simply a good game. That's it. Anyway, I am Renegade Operative. I am signing out. What do you guys think of this video? What do you think of people having these negative connotations on what should be or shouldn't be Resident Evil? Sound off in the comments below. Like I said, I am fine with action and I am fine with horror, as long as they develop games that are actually worthwhile and are interesting to play. Then I'm always going to put my $60 or $70 down no matter what. You see what I'm saying? So that's what I think on the matter. Comment below, let me know if you feel different. I just wanted to analyze this, and I kind of see why people say these things, because they want the classic back. And I do agree, I'm not being like fully negative here to classic fans or whatever. I do agree they should put out the classic games on modern platforms, because at this point, you see how Konami is doing it with the classic Metal Gear Solid collection. Volume 1 is obviously going to sell. That brings in a crowd. People are going to play those games despite the fact that the gameplay is a little bit dated, but hey, you know, they're still gonna buy it, play it, and enjoy it. And I think that should be the blueprint, just in case, so you can put that on modern platforms and people could experience it time and time again. And that's gonna make the content creators very happy, and that's gonna sell your game even more. I don't see a loss in that scenario. Oh, I got a little nugget, I got a little idea at the end of this. So I know that people will say, oh, Renegade, what do you think of games like RE Reverse that really inherently don't feel like the classic single player survival horror game that I look forward to? Well, there's different things in IP to look forward to. You can decide, hey, I don't really vibe with this PvP, it's not my sort of thing. But see, when you take a brand and you have those characters and you have that scenario, the creatures and whatnot, everything, it's all Resident Evil related. They're taking that brand IP and establishing that in various ways. Whether it works or doesn't work is relative to the observer, the stats, the sales, everything else. It doesn't diminish the fact that they are Resident Evil games, definitely, and they're being portrayed in ways that you may or may not resonate to. Granted, I've seen people use this criticism against the Resident Evil remakes, saying, oh, this is not RE games to me. They're because of the lore. It's like inherently they said that Capcom butchered the lore to the point where, because there's cut content, that is not a Resident Evil game. And I think that's like quite ludicrous. If you love the classics so much, you can find ways to play them. I mean, look, even though I advocated for things like them putting out a classic collection, that's not to say that they aren't Resident Evil games. It's just differing takes and renditions and reimaginations being presented to us in a modern fashion. If you don't like the fact that they're not really harkening back to bringing classic fixed camera tank controls back, and I talked about this time and time again, you would have found ways to play these older games by this point. I built a rig, I found ways to play games that simply weren't accessible anymore because I wasn't willing to go out and buy a physical copy for like 200 bucks. That's ridiculous. That's ludicrous to me. You know what I mean? So I went ahead and I solved the problem. I put on my pirate hat and I solved the problem because I wanted to experience those old games again. So if I felt like that, It was a problem that was presented. I found a solution. There you go. So I wouldn't say those games aren't inherently RE games just simply because they have cut content. Am I disappointed at some of the cut content ventures in these games and some of my reviews? Yes. In my opinion, is there portions of cut content like crows and everything else from RE2 Remake that didn't bother me? Yes, it didn't really affect me too much in all of the cuts presented, and I talked about them on my channel, and I'm going to talk about them again for RE4 Remake. So it's going to be things I feel indifferent about, and it's going to be things I felt, well, it's cut and I really didn't notice. The game's like 16 hours fat anyway. So there's people using this argument in differing ways where it doesn't even really make sense. Like, it's not a Resident Evil game because cut content. That, you know, if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, still quacks like one, I'm still going to see it as such. And you know, there are games where I don't like where they cut out way too much content, but that's a different story entirely, like RE3 Remake. To summarize this plainly, what makes Resident Evil is the characters, the biological weapons, the horror aesthetics, the puzzle solving, the adventure, the action. Is so much that makes a Resident Evil game, and what is synonymous with RE is biohazard. Biohazardous outbreak of tons of creatures going around and trying to fight and kill you to their leisure. That is Resident Evil, a biological menace, terrifying and stalking you around the corner in whatever way they see fit, whatever gameplay aesthetics they see fit. That is Resident Evil. As long as you're fighting creatures of an unknown entity and you are completely being hounded down and it is intense, then I'm gonna keep buying these games, whether it's action or horror. Like, as long as they entice me and suck me in like a cheap horror, then that in essence is Resident Evil. And what appeals to me is that it is one of the long-standing horror franchises of all time, and whatever direction they go into, if there's intrigue, I'm in. Like I said, that makes Resident Evil a biological menace, impacting and destroying lives as we see them unfold in these various stories. And they can remake RE5. They can do that. It can be action. People are gonna hate it. I think that sort of classic purist crowd already hates everything action oriented anyway, and it comes with the territory with them. But for me personally, I'm an RE fan first and foremost, and if it grips me, I'm in. And that's all I gotta say. So I'm signing off for real this time. No more PSs, no more side tangents, no more sort of adding on to this video. I think it's long enough, but hopefully you guys really get that there's so many multiple layers to this argument. And I think most people that do say, oh, this game isn't an RE game, it's just their way of casting it off and saying it's bad, I'm not going to ingest it, when it could be a good game. People said this about 7, they said this about the remakes, they said it about the action games, and some of those games could be perceived as good to the next person. There are games that are bad, and Resident Evil as a franchise, of course, Umbrella Corps. it's just like, that's the easy one. And I didn't like ORC that much either, but still, you're fighting biohazardous material, and sometimes you got fun with it. It's all about being a meta series and growing up and realizing that a game can have multiple takes and experiment for better or worse. And I'd rather them be creative than deal with what Silent Hill was doing, where it was nothing but bastardized games from no-name studios that nobody gave a fuck about, and the franchise was dead for 10 years before it finally came back. Yeah, I'd rather maintain my quality for RE than to deal with a situation like that where Konami fucked that up. Until then, I'll see you guys next time for real. Later.